And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 5 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. And once again, it's my perspective from my study, my research, of course, my love for my Italian heritage. Tonight, I'm going to get into the Abyssinian War, Mussolini's war in Abyssinia, right? Otherwise known, aka the war in Ethiopia in 1936. Now, I'm going to premise this by saying I'm going to give you a rough overview of the Abyssinian War. I have another book coming on it right now that kind of goes to the heart of fascist foreign policy in that era. I got a book coming by Luigi Villari, who was a top foreign minister under Mussolini. The book was written in 56. See, what I'm trying to do is go deep into the sources. The problem when you examine fascism is that you have liberal biases in the post-war era. And because fascism essentially evaporates after the war, a lot of the information we get is from a far left, well, Marxist communist perspective. And so what you have to do to really examine it and give fascism to get a true understanding is actually go to as close to the sources as you can to understand where they were coming from and what their positions were. This is what I'm going to be attempting to do here myself. So I may cover this again at some other time in grander detail, especially foreign policy that's very complex because there's a history there, especially in that region of, just to the east of Italy, in that sort of area where you have sort of the Slavic nations, right? You have Albania, you had one time Yugoslavia, you had Greece in that area, where things got a little murky because of lots of different foreign policy decisions, and really not just by Italy, but also as an end result of World War I and World War II. I think when we look at fascist foreign policy and how we get ultimately to World War II, you have to start with the end of World War I. And this is where it gets complex because the Italians broke their alliance with the Austro-Hungarians, broke their alliance with the Germans, and fought on the Allied side in World War I. There's many reasons for that, but a lot of it was with old rivalries and oppression that the Italians felt were coming specifically from the Austrian side, the Austrian Empire, right? Also, too, this would leave a great resentment between Italians and Germans after the war that eventually they would codify when the failed Austrian painter would come into power. But it would play a role after, again, Italy switched in 1943 when Mussolini was deposed, right? When we hear about the retribution that the Germans took in Italy, in the northern part of Italy, after Italy switched sides, a lot of it had to do with resentment by Germany for fighting on the Allied side in World War I. See, these things are very complex, right? These alliances, these treaties, they're all broken. And also, too, the Versailles Treaty, right? Which we all know was problematic. It was overly punitive on Germany. It led to the rise of Hitler in many ways. And it was unsustainable long-term, where a nation was so crushed, so put under the foot in sort of economic and social and moral sort of repression that the French and the British and the other Allied powers after World War I were trying to put on the Germans, that it was impossible for it not to lead to another war, which of course was World War II. It's one of the things that Mussolini warned about long before World War II, starting, I believe, in the 1920s, where he said, this is impossible. Germany is being punished to an extreme, right? The rumors were that you had, Germans going with barrels of money trying to buy a loaf of bread. Now, that may be an extreme exaggeration, but the greater point is inflation was tremendous because of all the debt that the Germans owed or got the blame from after World War I. the rumors of men selling their daughters into prostitution and wives into prostitution. These are all the stories we got. Whether they were true or not, in the most specific sense, I don't know. But the general understanding at the time was Germany was being punished too harshly by the Western Allied forces. And so we get to really the era of World War I with Italy. Italy fights, particularly in the northern part of Italy. They mainly fight, I believe it was the Austro-Hungarians. They fight valiantly. I believe the Italians lost, I think, right around 400,000 men overall, to the loss of life. Many more were injured as well, too. And it was a long, brutal, ugly war. Of course, we all know about World War I, trench warfare, diseases, new armaments that caused the types of injuries that warfare had never seen before. And in many ways, whether you're on the winning side or the losing side, those men came home damaged in one capacity or another. And Italy happened to be on the winning side, but here's the kicker. After World War I, you had a situation where you had a conference in France to see how, I guess, the spoils were going to be shared at the end of World War I. That's where we get, obviously, the Versailles Treaty. But one of the agreements before the war that the Allied forces, the likes of Woodrow Wilson, had made promises to Italy, saying, if you fight on our side, we will give you certain territories in that Slavic region there, right? You have Albania there, and you have a few other little nations, some German territories there as well, too. So Italians were fighting for these old territories that oftentimes Italians felt belonged to them anyways, but through historical disputes, right, they change hands, right? I mean, that part of the world was always back and forth. And there's a lot of foreign policies and treaties you have to go through to really understand who and what and where is the rightful, has the rightful entitlement to those territories. But Italy felt it belonged to them, and they were promised these lands in order to fight on the Allied side. And when World War I ended and Italy was on the winning side, they went to France. And in France, it was Woodrow Wilson and the British and the French that basically said to Italy, sorry, we're reneging on our process. That set in motion a resentment by Italians, particularly Italian soldiers. And it will also be the launching point for the fascist ideology, right? Fascism, as I said in the first part of this series, was a byproduct of what had happened after World War I. The vast majority of the fascist movement rises because these are veterans of World War I coming home. They're seeing their nation being taken over by Marxists. Particularly, you have a big split. Remember, Mussolini before World War I was a socialist. He was writing for the socialist newspaper called Avante. After the war, they saw the disrespect that the socialists were giving the Italian soldiers coming home because they denigrated Italy's war efforts in World War I. This is where the split comes. And Mussolini comes to the defense, and the fascists rise out of this, of the veterans coming home. The veterans come home, they're injured, they're demoralized, they have post-traumatic syndrome, they got robbed of their lands, and now within the realm of their own home nation, you have socialists running around denigrating all the great sacrifices at World War I. This was really the beginning of how fascism starts as a response to the socialist denigration of World War I efforts by veterans. In many ways, something somewhat comparable, not exactly the same. Imagine American soldiers coming home after the Vietnam War with a bunch of hippie communists, spitting on them and calling them rapists and racists and baby murderers because of the results or the disdain for the Vietnam War by socialists and communists. Something very similar was happening. I'm not saying it's exact parallel, but something very serious was happening. And while in America, we just took the disrespect for the military people coming home, in Italy, they weren't going to take that. Now, there was a greater direct association with the Soviet Union and Italy at the time, something that as Americans we never faced. But I'm trying to find some comparative analysis to show you what was going on at the time. Fascism launches as a result of this disrespect after World War I, that and along again with the Bolshevik, Marxist, communist infiltration of Italy. And this leads to a number of problems long term. You got issues going on in that Slavic region, debates over territories. Eventually, the fascist regime makes its claims on a few of these city-states across, the Mediterranean. I think that's the Adriatic there. Excuse me, I could be wrong on that. And eventually, Italy gains control of that. They gain control of Albania, which they make a proctorate state. And ironically enough, the Albanians were treated very well by the Italians. It's not after World War II that Albania faces the tyranny of communism, ironically enough. But, Mussolini, the fascists, spread economic prosperity in there, roads, hospitals, everything they needed. They were treated well by the fascists. But as World War II comes to an end and communists are coming in from the East, the Soviet Union is coming in from the East, things change. And after World War II, Albania and that region of the world begins to go through 50 years of tyranny in that region under communist rule and communist influence. So that's a nutshell story of post-World War I Italy and some of the things that happened, developed, treaties broken, promises not fulfilled, and it left Italy in a strange place, combined that with the infiltration of Marxism. Okay, perfect storm. So let's get now to the Ethiopian War. Mussolini comes to power in 1922. He's governing Italy. Excuse me. He's governing Italy. And a bunch of things start happening in Northern Africa. And there's a bunch of things going on. I probably can't highlight it all here tonight. But remember, Italy, France, and Britain all had a foothold in Northern Africa, right? You had a situation where a part of the time Tunisia was under Italian control. I can tell you that. My family, my grandfather's side of the family, great grandparents, for a period of time were in Tunisia. They went from Sicily to Tunisia. Great fishing industry over there. Great opportunity for Italians. It was Italian territory. And then when the tribal leaders of Tunis attacked Italian territories, the French came in to supposedly help the Italians, I believe, the way the story went, and the French never left, and they claimed that territory for themselves, which left a bitter taste in the mouths of Italian leadership, including Mussolini, right? You had a situation where you had French interests as well, too. I believe in Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, parts controlled by Italy, parts controlled by the British Empire, parts controlled by the French, and all these different factions competing colonial territories will come into conflict at some point. Plus, there was a history in Ethiopia where the Italians have fought the Ethiopians in 1896. It's termed as an embarrassing loss for the Italians in 1896 to lose to what is considered a backward sort of, culture with very limited technology. What is often not mentioned in the 1896 campaign is that the Ethiopians were aided by the Russians and the French, I believe, as well, too. And that would always play a role because the British and the French were always there in some capacity that would play in the grander scheme of politics. Now, in regards to Ethiopia, it's very interesting because it was a state that was somewhat primitive still. It was a tribalist state, from my understanding, and more importantly, it was a slave state. And what you had is a situation where neighboring Somalia and Eritrea, which were Italian control, under British influence, the Ethiopians would eventually attack the Italian Somalilands as well as Eritrea, right? There was a great battle at Walla Walla, which was Ethiopia attacking an Italian base at the encouragement of the British. The British wanted the Italians out. They wanted territory for themselves. Eventually, the United Nations would clear Italy of any wrongdoings and blame Ethiopia for the attack. But this set up a condition for which Italy had a choice to make here. You had a situation again where Ethiopia would raid Somaliland, Italian-held controlled Somaliland, steal slaves, bring them back, enslave them, sell them, all kinds of human rights abuses. You also had the fact that the British Empire was motivated, had their own motivations in Ethiopia. Part of it was resources. Let's remember here. I think this is important to remember here. Turn of the 19th century, we go through the Industrial Revolution. What's fascinating is the moment you get to the Industrial Revolution and we start shifting away from agricultural societies to these massive industries, one of the things that you need to have a massive industry is natural resources. Now, for countries like Soviet Union or Russia, America, Great Britain that has an empire all over the world, natural resources at the turn of the century as we get into industrialization, it wasn't that big of a problem because they had those natural resources. One of the things that the Axis powers eventually would have in common is a lack of natural resources, which would eventually cost them the war, at least in part. And so here comes Italy, is primarily an agricultural nation. Now we find ourselves in the midst of the again, Industrial Revolution. Where are we going to get these resources? Well, they were dependent on the Soviet Union. They were dependent on America. They were dependent on the British Empire. And as these nations, which would be the Axis powers, didn't want to be influenced by liberalism or communism, they felt the need that they needed their own natural resources. So when Mussolini is going into a place like Ethiopia, again, lots of foreign policy nuance, the idea that resources was at play was very real, without a doubt. But then again, what is the difference between Italy desiring its own natural resources so it can maintain independence? Remember, economically, Italy wanted to be independent of these Western powers. It wanted to do its own thing because fascism was ultra-nationalistic. So it could create its own industries. It could stay within, limit what is ultimately imported from these liberal nations so they could protect their own kind of ideas and national identity. This is where a lot of the banking laws and things like that and international financiers come into play, things of that nature. But for a nation like America, who had conquered the Western territories from, again, what do you want to call it, past, the Great Arches, the Louisiana Purchase, all out west to the California territories, they had captured, America had, all the natural resources they needed. Eventually, of course, under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted to go all over the world to spread democracy. In the Spanish-American War, Cuba was a target, the Philippines, Guam. America had built its empire by spreading maybe a generation or two earlier. The British Empire, same thing. The British Empire was spreading even before the American Empire. They had lands in Canada. Obviously, America at one time was an offshoot of the British Empire. Australia, India, they had their infrastructure and ultimately the resources they needed through colonization throughout the entire world, right? Soviet Union, big swath of land, naturally had its own natural resources. The Allied powers would have all these resources. But a nation like Italy and Japan especially, they lacked a lot of natural resources in order to be independent or at least compete on the world stage. Both Italy and Japan lacked oil, steel, and coal, which was a big problem. And so expanding the empire for economic means, it was a goal without a doubt. But then again, everybody was doing that. What was fascinating was after the British Empire had collected an empire the previous 2 or 3 centuries, however long it was, when the threat or the notion of Italy going into Ethiopia and colonizing came up, the British began to go through this wave of anti-colonialism as being unjust and racist and all this other stuff, trying to discourage powers from spreading to the world using political correctness. But what was fascinating about the British position was that they were not willing to give up their empire. They were already established there. They just now didn't want the spreading of new empires, especially when it came to Mussolini. And this is where we get into democratic sensibilities, right? Because democracy is seen as the gold standard. And once democracy is the gold standard, it's viewed upon as a virtuous act. And so when democracy spread throughout the world and colonized, it's a good thing. We're here. We're the will of the people. We're here to spread goodness, freedom, prosperity, all this good stuff. When a fascist authoritarian regime comes in, of course, that is something of a negative connotation. Of course, they want power. That's how fascism is defined in the eyes of sort of democratic principalities. What is fascinating is a lot of these colonial powers, when they went into these territories, never gave the indigenous people the right to vote. They limited those votes so they can maintain control. So there's kind of a duplicitous kind of motivations here, right? We stand for goodness, we stand for freedom, we stand for liberty, we stand for democracy, but we dare not risk, our power base ultimately at the end of the day by extending these rights and these freedoms to even the indigenous populations. Let's be honest, they wanted to control the means of natural resources. And in some ways, understandably so, right? They just didn't want to expand it to non-democratic nations. And quite frankly, they probably wanted it for themselves. And as we saw with the British and the French in that region of the world, everybody was competing for it. And Libya became a battleground for that. So the precursor to the Ethiopian War was interesting. There was lots of squabbling back and forth. The other thing you had was the Italians felt an insecurity about what was happening in Ethiopia because there was a history there. And what come to find out is that the French were actually aiding the Ethiopians with military armaments. This caused a certain panic in Italian foreign policy and what sped the rush up to the war in 1936. Couple that with the fact that the British were pushing against it. Finally, as Mussolini decided, now let's remember a couple of things that are important here. Before the war, remember the Ethiopian leader who was termed the Negus, right, which is a term for king in Ethiopian. His name was Salis. That was his name, Salis. He was a guy that aided obviously with the French, as I mentioned earlier, but he refused to ban slavery in that state. The British were there. Slavery was a part of their economy. And so when it came to the issue of slavery, this became a sticking point for everybody, including the British. Who it wasn't a sticking point for was Mussolini. And the slavery issue would actually be part and parcel, a big split between the British and the Italians when it came to the war in Abyssinia. When it looked like the Italians were going to go in, at last minute, the British tried to cut a deal with the Italians and Mussolini. The deal was they would split Ethiopia, right? And hence you avoid war. Here was the problem with the deal that the British presented. One, the British presented a deal that gave them the natural resource-rich lands of Ethiopia. And number two, and this is a big one, and it was big, the British did not oppose slavery, or at least ending slavery in Ethiopia. Mussolini wanted to end slavery in Ethiopia. It's fascinating. And this plays into sort of the moral politics, because back in Italy, Mussolini had received really moral support, moral legitimacy from the Italian bishop saying, okay, listen, this slavery stuff, this is bad. It's a backward ass slave state. It's tribalistic. It's brutal in nature in its practices. It lacks basic elements of human rights. He got the full support of the bishops, and I believe he got tacit support of Pope Pius XI. So there was a moral crusade aspect to this, right? Sure, natural resources played a part in this, but also there was a moral crusade here, which played a role. And so when Mussolini rejected the proposal by the British to split Ethiopia, that's where the British were, excuse my language, apeshit crazy. Specifically, top foreign minister Anthony Eden, who would never forgive Mussolini for this humiliating act of rejecting that agreement and ultimately going into Ethiopia and taking over all of Ethiopia at that point. When Mussolini later on tried to get on the Allied side, Eden wasn't going to let him in. Never forgave him. Mussolini always wanted, again, sort of legitimacy, an understanding that Ethiopia was Italian territory. The British never gave it to him. And when it came to the negotiations of World War II, where we started dealing with the failed Austrian painter, the Ethiopian War was always there. It's what split Italy from the Allies. It is the Ethiopian War. That's why it's a huge deal at the end of the day, what happened in that territory. And so the Italians go in. It's a slow start in the war, and it's not looking very good, right? You already got the memories of losing in 1896 in that territory. I think there was other conflicts even after that. You got two generals there. I believe it was Di Bono and Graziani, who just were generals that didn't risk. They weren't willing to attack, do what was necessary. Italians used light forces there, quick forces, lightning forces. Eventually, you had a general that actually disregarded Graziani, who I believe was the top general, and attack fast, attack hard the Ethiopian advancing troops, and Italy started pushing back, and eventually Italy would win that war. Okay. Now, this is where a lot of liberal historians get Mussolini for his, atrocities or crimes against humanity is in Abyssinia. Fascinating, because there's so much nuance here, so much to say about this. One of the things that you hear constantly is how Italy used poison gas against the Ethiopians, and they did. Here's the thing about poison gas, right? Because remember, this is what, a violation of the United Nations, things of that nature. It was banned after World War I, right? But in Italy, now I'm quoting here the Nicholas Ferro book, I believe. In Italy, they had banned using poison gas, mustard gas in an offensive measure, but not in defensive measures. And so as Ethiopian troops were advancing, Italians used gas in order to push them back. Now, here's the key. Italians never used poison gas against civilians. See, and this is where the discrepancies come in, because when you look at the crimes really on all sides in World War II, the Americans dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, atomic bombs that purposely targeted civilians. Same with Winston Churchill in Dresden. What Churchill did in Dresden was horrible. He turned that entire city into a furnace where people hiding in basements and bunkers were effectively cooked to death because of the type of bombing he used, right? It wasn't a strategic military bombing. It was a type of bombing that was going to create, again, a giant inferno, wiping out, incinerating everything in Dresden. It's one of the great crimes of World War II that's never talked about, but that's for another time. And so when it came to Italians using the mustard gas, they used it in defensive positions to push back troops. They never used it against civilians. But here's the other factor. The mustard gas, or the poison gas the Italians used, was not used until they figured out, or, okay, basically, the Ethiopians were using illegal weapons themselves. Exploding bullets that would tear apart inside the human body, which were also banned by international law, ironically enough. It was after Italians were exposed to exploding bullets that eventually Italians will come to use the mustard gas. And so as a result of that, you have pictures of Italian troops after the Ethiopian War hanging, military troops, things of that nature. But this was in response to atrocities committed. You also had a situation where you had an Italian general after the war was won by the Italians. You had some Ethiopians throw a couple of grenades in an attempt to kill the general after the war at a party. A bunch of people were killed and injured in that. Italians took reprisals after that. Again, it was a reactive measure. The estimations on how many died in Italy's response to that attack, it varies, but most people think it wasn't very much. Martin Goldberg argues that it was a very low number. So these things did happen. It's part of war, without a doubt. And so that, in effect, is the Ethiopian War. Italy wins. It takes over Ethiopia. And what does it do? It brings the Ethiopian people into the fold. First thing you have is Mussolini freed 400,000 slaves. In fact, this is what's fascinating. The lead up to the war, right? Because it did play a vital role. The idea of freeing slaves. And there was a big moral quandary. Again, Mussolini, under the guise of, again, slavery, the brutality, human rights violations, could get the church's approval of this. And so the lead up to the war is interesting, because what you have here is a bunch of songs that were written by Italians as they marched to war in Ethiopia. And I want to read to you these two poems here that are very interesting to me, right? Let's see here. Quote, "Pretty black face, beautiful Abyssinian, wait and see, for the hour is coming when we are with you. We shall give you another law and another king. Our law is slavery of love. Our motto is freedom and duty. We, the black shirts, will avenge you, the heroes that died to free you. Pretty black face, you will be Roman. Your only flag will be the Italian one. We will march together with you and parade in front of the Duce and the king." Here's another one. "We are valiant formations of indomitable warriors carrying the flag into East Africa. Slavery and barbarity are doomed to vanish the very moment the Roman eagles appear." End quote. So there was a moral crusade there by the fascists to end slavery. If you know anything about Mussolini, he's fascinating. Mussolini never had an issue with race. In fact, Mussolini is known for criticizing America at that time when blacks were being lynched in the South. He thought America was barbaric in that sense, that they couldn't get their racial divisions straightened out in America. It's one of the things he critiqued America for, where in Italy, blacks were, or at least in the Northern African region, were treated almost equivalent to Italian citizens. In fact, he went down there. He actually, let me get this straight. He had admiration for the Ethiopian race that he said was a certain tribe. I got it here, that linked him back to King Solomon. That's how he viewed him in that respect, according to the Martin Goldberg book. Furthermore, Mussolini held up the sword of Islam as well too, in his attempt to bring peace into that region, because that was one of his priorities, was always peace. This is the opposite of what we've been told by liberal historians, right? But he did hold up the sword of Islam. Now, how you quantify that with his Catholic faith, it's great, but I think he understood this is what that region of the world was. You were going to have to work with these different cultures. He's trying to bring that unity together, bring respect, doesn't want the wars, doesn't want the racial divisions. Obviously, he's got a problem with Italians intermixing with the native population. One of the things that happened, interesting, after the war, I don't know if this was from the Nicholas Farrow book, but after the war was over in Ethiopia, a lot of the soldiers and military, and Italian men began, patronizing, whatever you want to call it, courting a lot of the Ethiopian women. They were the conquerors. They were the winners, right? And so the problem Mussolini had with that was that he didn't want a situation as a conqueror to be seen or use that power to fraternize, I guess, would that be the word? To take control or abuse that system where Italian men were using Ethiopian women for their own purposes. I'm not sure if racial intermixing was the problem, which it could have been, but it was more of, listen, we're the conquerors, but we can't act like animals in there. So he banned relations between, again, Italian natives and the Ethiopian population, where I believe was the men could not court the women and vice versa. He wanted this thing to be pure for the right reasons, ultimately, right? To liberate them from slavery, to bring economic prosperity. And that's what the Italians did. They brought roads, they brought hospitals, they brought modern medicine, they brought in education, right? They began to import in native Italians from the mainland, obviously, to help, build the nation in many ways, especially agriculturally. And so there was a lot of positive benefits. This is why people will say, when you look at the pictures of Ethiopia and even the parts of Libya that Italy controlled, you see the people were happy. You had structures, you had buildings, you had architecture that was beautiful. They built infrastructure, they brought plumbing in, things of that nature. Remember, Ethiopia doesn't become a mess till after the Italians are actually kicked out after World War II, obviously. So you saw the positive effects that Italy had in that region, taking what was a tribalistic, really backward states in many ways, slave state, and bringing it into the modern world is what they did. And so that in and of itself was fascinating. Now, of course, the Italian rule of Ethiopia was short. I think by 1940, as Mussolini and the Italians go into World War II, they align themselves with the failed Austrian painter. Things go pretty bad. They just weren't ready to fight in the desert. As the Americans and the British came in there, Italy had light forces, fast but smaller mechanized vehicles, and the British and the Americans brought in the big guns, and it was really no match that the Italians. It was very difficult for Italy to get more troops down there to defend North America because that war has spread all over. Like, remember, Italy wasn't ready for that war for various reasons. Okay, one, World War II, right? One, it helped Franco in 1936. So in 1936, it fought two wars. It helped Franco in Spain, and it fought the war in Ethiopia. This is why when Mussolini makes the Pact of Steel, signs the Pact of Steel with Hitler, he tells Hitler, listen, I need 3 to 4 years here. I just helped Franco, and I just fought in Ethiopia. I got to rebuild my military. Plus, if we go to war with the British and the French, I have to move my military factories from the north down south, away from the bombing lanes. And every time, it's funny, every time, and this is Lamb here, Richard Lamb, that talks about this in a fantastic book about the war diplomacy aspects, right? It's called Mussolini and the British. But every time Hitler made a promise to Mussolini, Hitler reneged on it. Mussolini wanted 3 to 4 years. Within a month, Hitler is invading everybody. And the moment Hitler goes into France, and I believe he goes into France 1940, Mussolini throws his hands up in the air. It's like, we just made a deal a month ago. You told me I had 3 to 4 years. A month later, Hitler's running through the Maginot Line, bursting into France. And it's like, what do you do here if you're Italy? Because there was an aspect of Mussolini where he got greedy at that point. He saw how powerful Hitler was. Hitler had gone through all of Europe, right? Denmark, Belgium, Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Australia. In many ways, his decision to join Hitler was, well, shit, if I don't join him, he's going to run me over. But the moment he runs into France, he's got these weakened troops that attack in the south part of France to join Hitler, and it doesn't go well. It doesn't go well at all. But again, they weren't ready to fight this war. They needed more time. So there's a lot going on here at that time. And why the Italian forces are weak, I think part of it is technologically they were backwards. Here's another issue that went wrong actually during World War II for the Italians. Mussolini was trying to build the strength of the lira, right? That was their money they had over there. Trying to put an equal par with the American dollar, the British pound, and what is it? What did they got in France? The franc, right? In order to do that, he had to cut spending in order to balance the budget, right? Why are we going through inflation today? Why is the dollar falling? Because we run all this massive debt. Well, Mussolini wasn't running debt over there. He didn't want to run debt. And so he had to cut the budget. And I believe this is as early as 33, 34. Where do they cut the budget from? The Air Force. The Air Force. And so when Italy goes into World War II, it has virtually no Air Force. It has an Air Force that's about 15, 20 years out of date. And World War II eventually is won in the air. That's how the British and the Americans also beat the Germans, right? But Italy doesn't have an effective Air Force because Mussolini had cut the budget of the Air Force Department. Again, thinking he had time to build his military again. And Hitler is just going all over the map and leaving Mussolini's position, throwing his hands up in the air. What do I do here? Right. And that was ultimately the question, right? With Mussolini, his grand mistake, he needed to stay out of that war. He needed to stay out of that alliance like Franco did. Franco stayed out of it, right? It's interesting with Franco. After Mussolini and Hitler helped Franco win the Spanish Civil War in 1939, he got most of the help from Mussolini, okay? Hitler did help some as well, too, but Mussolini's the one that really helped him. What was interesting about Mussolini's help to Franco was that Mussolini put no conditions on Franco on what he wanted. None. He just went in there and helped them. It created a bunch of problems later on because Franco had a different vision of how that war is going to be fought and won. Mussolini wanted, the nationalists to beat the Republic fast, quick, fast. Let's get it over with and let's get out. Franco wanted to extend the war and really drain the resources of the Republic, really beating them down as much as he could. This frustrated Mussolini. And so when he had no stipulations on his help, Franco just didn't care for the most part. He knows Mussolini is there. What was he going to do? See, these are interesting little nuances, and Mussolini got stuck in this. Now, why didn't Mussolini ultimately ask for any stipulations? I don't know. Was it altruistic? Because Franco was fighting communists? Because that's what the Republic side was. It was communist. Well, it was communist, it was socialist, it was anarchist. Eventually, it is the communist side that becomes dominant. Remember, Stalin was sending things in. He was sending armaments into the Republic to fight against Franco in that war. And again, Mussolini and Hitler are helping Franco. In fact, you got the French and the Soviets who are allied that are helping the Republic. You see what's going on here? The French were always a problem for the Italians as well as the British. The French, I think, were the bigger problem, but Anthony Eden's rejection of Mussolini, that was the final death nail in many respects. And so Mussolini goes into this thing, maybe made a mistake, not asking for stipulations, but Mussolini hated communism. He hated communism. That's, I think, the most simple explanation. He wanted Franco to win because he had already fought the communists in Italy in the 19-teens and the 1920s, understood what Franco was going through over there. And so he got himself caught up in the pickle. So World War II comes and, Hitler starts going all over the place. He's like, listen, again, I've been in Bosnia, I've been in Spain. I need time to rebuild this thing, move my factories around. But Hitler didn't care. And that's where Mussolini got into a lot of problems. But when it came to the Bosnian War, it's one of those things where it was a battle for resources that played a role. The French and the British were highly annoyed with the Italians. And here's the final point, I think, when it comes to the Bosnian War, what you have to understand. It is the difference between authoritarian nations and democracy. Democracy being as the standard bearer of goodness and truth and justice, while authoritarian governance fashion is seen something equivalent of something evil, right? Never mind that the Allies also joined with a despotic genocidal regime in the Soviet Union. That's always ignored oftentimes. And so how these things all come together and the contradictions are very interesting. But there was a point after Mussolini and the Italians had won in the Bosnia that the British were willing to give concession and acknowledgement to the Italian victory, because that's what Mussolini was wanting from the British. He just wanted acknowledgement. He wanted acknowledgement. And that lack of acknowledgement actually pushed Mussolini into Hitler's arms, according to Richard Lamb, or at least played a big role. But I think it was Churchill, maybe Neville Chamberlain, at one point said, okay, let's get Mussolini on board. The more help, the better. Especially because, remember, Mussolini had a relationship with Hitler. He could talk to Hitler. And because the French and the British were going through these appeasement process, waiting papers, we got peace, Mussolini became a broker, right? Remember, Mussolini stopped World War II twice. He stopped it after the Chancellor of Austria was assassinated by sending 4 battalions of troops to the Brenner Pass, discouraging the Germans in 33, 34 from conquering Austria, at least the first time. And then at the Conference of Munich, it was Mussolini again being the broker between Hitler and the British and the French that stopped World War II. Was it Munich was 36, I believe, right? It's where they divided Czechoslovakia, but it averted the war. That's where a lot of people say that Hitler could have been stopped at the Conference of Munich. There was an issue of an idea that some of the generals were going to overthrow him. And while Germany was getting strong, they quite weren't there yet. And if the British, the French, and the Italians, which was the Stresa Conference, right? Stresa Conference 34, right? That was, I believe, designed to discourage Hitler. If they would have united, they could have stopped Hitler. The problem was, and Munich was, the French and the British didn't want war. And Mussolini's position was, listen, if you're going to stop him, you better stop him now. Because it's going to get to a point where I'm not going to be able to stop this thing at some point. I can't control this. I can only play diplomacy with him for so long. If you guys come now, we can stop him. But again, the British and the French were going through appeasement movements, right? That's what ultimately, when Adolphus is assassinated, who was a devout Catholic and a good friend of Mussolini's. Remember the story on that one? Boy, I'm getting to the World War II stuff now. I've deviated from Bosnia. Remember, what was it, 33, 32, 33? Hitler sent some mercenaries in there. Now Hitler disavowed that he had anything to do with that, but everybody knows Hitler was going after Austria. Everybody knew that. The story was that Adolphus was going to visit Mussolini the day before he was assassinated. And on that day before he was assassinated, his wife came to Rome first, right? She settled in the hotel, things of that nature. Adolphus is coming the next day. And on the day of assassination, Mussolini is visiting a mental hospital somewhere near, I think it was Rome. It might have been Rome, excuse me. And one of his aides comes to him and he finds out that Adolphus was just assassinated. And immediately Mussolini knew it was Hitler who did it. And he was stunned. And the reports are, it's like, that son of a bitch did it. Mussolini rushes off, goes visits the wife, now the widow of Adolphus, breaks the news to her, and then orders 4 battalions of Italian troops to the Brenner Pass. That's how that happened. And it discouraged Hitler. Hitler disavowed it. Didn't attack Austria, not yet. But that's the story with Austria. He actually prevented it there. He saw Adolphus as a great ally. Anyways, I'm getting off on World War II tangents here. I'm going to cover this topic a little bit more closely, another cast. But as far as the Bosnia, the British never gave affirmation to Mussolini because of Anthony Eden. Oh, I remember my point now. And even when the other diplomats, Chamberlain, Churchill said, okay, let's give him recognition. Let Mussolini have Ethiopia. Let's bring him on our side. There was one problem: democracy and the will of the people. The problem was that the British Parliament could not be sold on giving affirmation to Mussolini because the population was anti-authoritarian. They believed in democracy. And the parliament came to the top leaders of Britain and said, listen, you affirm this, we're going to get wiped out at the polls. Our people don't want you to affirm Mussolini. And that affirmation never came because of what was running in the press in Britain at the time and anti-democratic sentimentalities. And ultimately, that was one of the nails in the coffin that sent Mussolini into Hitler's camp eventually. There you have it there. So that's in a nutshell. There's more details there to go through. Like I said, I got a book coming by Luigi Vallari that goes deep into foreign policy. I'm going to read that one, go through it. And I may cover this a little bit more because there's so much there that gets us to World War II. Abyssinia was the key that split the British and the Italians. It separates them, and it's how these alliances, starting in 1939 with the Pact of Steel, it's how all of this forms. Richard Lamb's book, The British and Mussolini, is a wonderful book, very easy to read. It lays out all the diplomatic details that gets us to World War II and how these alliances form. I'm going to cover that eventually, but the Abyssinia War, Italy wins it. It brings great prosperity, roads, things like that, but it was short-lived because as the British rejected Italy, World War II starts. Eventually, Italy loses that territory. And there you have it. That's the Abyssinia War in a nutshell. Mussolini freed 400,000 slaves, never given credit for it. Eventually, Ethiopia would banish slavery, but it wouldn't come till 1942. After the British had massive influence over Ethiopia again, they took their time. What Mussolini ended in slavery, it actually came back after British rule, ironically enough. And that, in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is a little story, or is really, some of the details behind the Abyssinian War, the Abyssinian affair, Ethiopia, as we come to know it in modern times. And it's fascinating. It's a fascinating story, fascinating history, lots of diplomacy, lots of history, lots of diplomatic nuances throughout the entire region of that world, of that war and that period of history. But there you have it. I want to thank you for joining me. This is part 5 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. Tonight, focusing on the Abyssinian War, aka the Ethiopian War between Mussolini and Ethiopia. I want to thank you for joining me again. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.